Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. In this podcast, Julienne Ryan and I, Jerome DeRoy, discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. There are more people today who identify as disengaged at work than there are who say that they feel engaged. We come from Narrative, which is a company that employs a storytelling method, which has 7 steps. And what we do with that is we engage businesses and their audiences. And it's really using the power of listening and storytelling. And so we often have guests on this podcast. And today we're really happy to have Amy Bach, who is the founder and executive director of Measures for Justice, a criminal justice nonprofit that develops data tools and services that help communities, including the institutions that serve them, and that reshape how the system works. Amy founded the organization in 2011 as a follow-up to her acclaimed book, Ordinary Injustice: How America Holds Court, which won the 2010 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. 2019, it's worth noting that she won the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences Leadership and Innovation Award and the Charles Bronfman Prize for Young Humanitarians. She lives in Rochester, New York, and that's where Measures for Justice is based. So Amy, welcome to the show.
Jerome, thank you for that beautiful introduction. But before we even begin, I just have to give you a little bit. I do remember the organization before I met you. And I remember I called you because I had given a pitch to a funder, and the funder said to me, I just don't understand what you're doing, what you want to do. And so I came to you, and then we worked together. And then a couple months later, I had another pitch, and the funder said to me, just before I even begin, I just want to tell you that was the best pitch I've ever heard. Wow. And that was literally because you helped me really hone my stories so that I could represent what I was doing before I even understood totally what I was doing. So when you asked me to do this podcast, it's like, oh, I'll do anything for Jerome, because you're part of the founding, you're part of the one of the main nuggets that grew into this beautiful thing.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I remember that day very well when I presented at Echoing Green, and then you came through the doors of our very small office at the time in Midtown Manhattan, I remember. That's it's hard to believe.
Tell me what's in your listening. And I said, what does that mean? And now we use it all the time. Now we use it all the time in our organization.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great. And I'm so delighted that you're on the show and that I can introduce you to Julienne, who's here too, and just have this conversation, which I think is really important for our listeners, because there's the aspect that we just talked about in terms of listening and storytelling, which we always talk about, but understanding also a little bit more about your organization and how you've even used the power of storytelling, I think is kind of an interesting thing when we talk about data and statistics and things that are perceived as being dry. So I'm curious, from maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and kind of that journey to coming up with this idea, and what caused you to look into this.
Well, I went to college actually to study literature, and I wanted to be a journalist. I was editor of the school paper. And after college, I decided to be a journalist, and I wrote for a newspaper in Arizona. And then I actually ended up at a law magazine, and that really made me want to go to law school. And I went through, 3 years of law school, clerked for a judge. And after my clerkship, I decided to spend a year as a fellow for The Nation magazine. And I was doing that fellowship when I got an idea for a book. And the book, which was published in 2010, it's called Ordinary Injustice, How America Holds Court, was published in 2010, and then Measures for Justice began out of that book the following year.
So how does that happen? How do you go from, a book that you write, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the process of writing that book. What was how did that idea actually, you say, was born out of the book? So was there a kind of a moment where you thought, oh, now it's not good enough to write a book. I have to create an organization. I don't think a lot of necessarily authors would think that way, right? Or maybe they do, I don't know. But in your case, that's what happened, and fairly soon after the book was published.
Right. So the book, Ordinary Injustice, it shows how groups of very well-intentioned prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys can be so blind to a pattern of problems that they no longer actually can see what's in front of them. In terms of criminal justice, it was super early on the curve of people really noticing that there are these widespread ordinary injustices. And I was in this county called Quitman County, Mississippi. It's where Marks, Mississippi is the county seat. And I met this court clerk, and her name is Miss Wiggs. And I went there, and it was like this sort of hard scrabble town. The sidewalk was crumbly, it was poor. And I've been to many towns like this, and there's always a ton of people in the hallways waiting to see the public defender. But in this town, almost nobody came to court. And so I went to the court clerk and I said to Miss Wiggs, who's sort of an older woman who ran she kept track of what cases went to court and what didn't. Mm-hmm. I said to her, where are all the people? And she said, you want to know? And she pointed to this list of cases that she kept above her desk. They were handwritten cases. And she said, every month we're supposed to have court, and these people their cases are supposed to be presented, but they never come to court. So I said, well, what do you do with this list of cases? And she goes, I put it in this folder. And I said, can I see this list? And so she let me then see it, and then I Xeroxed this list of cases, and then I used this list, which is the chapter in the book is called Miss Wiggs's List. I used Miss Wiggs's list as a roadmap to see what kinds of cases weren't being prosecuted. And what I found was that there were enormous swaths of cases, huge gaps in what wasn't being prosecuted. One time I went down this dirt road, and I went to this trailer, and I knocked on the door, and I met this woman who had been beaten up. And the case file showed that she'd been beaten up under a bridge by her boyfriend. So since that happened, she had left her boyfriend. And so she told me the story that she had been at a club. He yanked her out of the club, put her in the car where he had her two small children. And then he took her under a bridge and just beat her with a tire iron so that she couldn't work. She used to work as a housekeeper at a casino. She couldn't do anything, so she left him that day. And I said, so what happened to the case? Why wasn't it prosecuted? And she said, I have no idea. So I went back to Miss Wiggs and I said, well, why wasn't this case prosecuted? And so we looked back in these big brown bound volumes, these brown volumes that have gold embossed, leers on their spines. And we looked, and Miss Wiggs came back and she said, he hasn't prosecuted a domestic violence case in 21 years. Wow. And then we went to the prosecutor and I said, okay, it looks like you haven't prosecuted a domestic violence case in 21 years. And he said, quote unquote, has it been that long? And then we started looking at other things that he wasn't prosecuting. So basically what he would do is he would do these really big important cases or easy cases, and then cases that took a lot of work, he would put those aside because he said he had a huge workload and across many towns that he was working in across the jurisdiction. So it really became a metaphor for ordinary injustice, this idea that there are patterns and errors and omissions that we just can't see because there's no data. If you went to the counties around that county and you asked, well, how many cases do you prosecute domestic violence? They could look back in their notebooks or in their crappy computer files and see it, but they couldn't, see how they performed next to another county, next to another county. So the idea for Measures for Justice was, could we create a system that would be like an early warning system so that you could see cases and patterns before they became chronic? And that was the conclusion of the book. And and then it really became realized when I got a small grant from an anonymous donor, and people said that it was impossible to do this work. Like, I remember one guy said to me, like, I tried to do something like this when I was, a big deal in the Department of Justice, and it doesn't work. We had many people say that, and we were just really hopeful, really naive. And we came in and we created not only the methodology to do the measurement, but we created, we got public data, and we got experts involved, and eventually you could see really amazing things like, low-level misdemeanor crimes, how long people are staying in jail, or different demographics and how they're treated, so you could break things down by race, by sex, by age, and gender. And we're in a moment right now where everybody wants this data. So we were luckily ahead of the curve, and people want the system to be safer. They want it to be more fair, and they really want it to save money. So if you want to do those things, you need the data. That's why our motto is no data, no change.
Well, that's terrific. The fact that you were ahead of the case. We're all talking data analytics in every post lately when you go on social media, and you really recognize where the numbers tell a story and how to find the numbers.
Yeah. And, I also have to say that, well, first of all, that what you were just describing there, this portal where you can find all these measures, that's now available to the public, right? That's on your website, and people can go to that.
Yeah, we did 20 states of court data, and that's all available. And then, once we figured out the measures, and we, in a sense, we changed the world, because people now all accept, as you're saying, that as Julienne was saying, that you have to measure everything. And everyone now accepts that. But when we began, it was a new thing, and then people didn't think it could happen in the justice system. So now we've changed what we're doing somewhat. It's not the same organization when we started, because the world has changed.
Yeah, I remember that when we first met, that was part of the sort of introduction to Measures for Justice, or for the idea, at least, for people to support you, is that we measure everything. We know what the best hospitals are, we know what the best schools are, but in terms of our criminal justice system, we have no idea. And it's really county by county, and that really resonated, that idea, with me. Because I think we're all used to that. If you watch a game, there's statistics. If you everything, my school sends me reports. My son's school, and that sort of thing. But the other thing that I was going to say,
in Albuquerque, how does your criminal justice system perform, and how does it compare to the other cases in Nevada? Would you know?
No. Well, I would go to the Measures for Justice website and see if New Mexico is included or not. But because literally there is no, if there is, it's certainly not widely known like these other examples, hospitals, schools, and even law firms, right? You get these magazines, and there's often this top 10 doctors, top 10 lawyers,
sure.
top 10, everything's a top 10, but you never see that about judges, public defenders, anything to do with the criminal justice system. Even still with all the, which I'm assuming is something that has been beneficial to Measures for Justice, is a kind of a change in mindset around criminal justice reform. In the last few years, 10 years, maybe, one of those rare bipartisan things. But even so, it's still quite unclear to me where to be able to go. So that's why I think this is really life changing. And I'm wondering, there's you told us this story about Miss Wiggs and the binders, et cetera. And I just have to say that I remember seeing you tell that story all those years ago, before Measures for Justice was what it is now, at a fundraising event, and you could really hear a pin drop when you told that story. It was pretty, and what I remember also clearly is that there were many hands that went up at the end of that story and said, how can I help? What do we do about this? And you had your answer, because Measures for Justice was right there, and you could tell them quite clearly, what your solution was. But that idea that, that story was really the thing that propelled, or made this idea very real to people, I think, being able to portray the pain of someone not going through the system, being refused, where their case was just refused to be
Right. I mean,
tried.
and the thing about the story that was so helpful is, I mean, if I hadn't spent 7 years writing a book, I never would have been able to find what you're looking for is the invisible. And it's like all in the little details of that can express the problem so people can understand it in a story. But the most powerful thing would be if I had the Miss Wiggs story plus, which I did. I mean, there was no, the data, right? Which is there was no domestic violence cases prosecuted in 21 years. But those two things together, like ideally, you always want to have a story with the data, because people, the number, if I just told you there hasn't been a domestic violence case in this process between 21 years, maybe you'd be like, okay, well, is that because everyone just gets along there? Is that because, there are no women who live there? There people aren't married. I don't know. It could be many, many things, right? Maybe it's just a loving place, but instead, I know, because I went to the other side of the train tracks and I talked to all, literally, like, people in the communities, and they've said, oh my gosh, this person is beaten up, this person, but it never ever goes anywhere. So we don't even bother reporting it. So that's it's the number plus the story that I think is the ultimate 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
I want to weigh in, because on one other point before we move ahead to another point in conversation, is how powerful were these points of collaboration really helped bring your ideas forward. You had Miss Wiggs, like that you met her and she was open to talking with you and getting involved, or just doing the simple act of going to find binders, and how that collaboration and you were listening and asking her questions made a difference. And then a little way down the road, collaborating with Jerome, who had an objective viewpoint about what he heard in your story, what elements. So I always think that's really interesting to hear about a backstory, about how something evolved from concept, gut instinct perhaps, to where it is, and how you got the data to tell a story and build some context.
Yeah, the gut thing is really big. Because I was in Quitman County for months. Okay, so, and I didn't have a lot of money at that point to actually do the reporting. I mean, I got some fellowships, but those, I was, paying rent, so you're out there really, spending your last dollar trying to sleep on people's couches in the town, trying to figure out like what this is going to be about. And it took me a long time to see the pattern and to understand it, and really scouring my notes. I was very lucky to have Miss Wiggs, because here's the thing, that it doesn't happen like it happened because I had people who, again, like opened their hearts to me. Like, you know, I became pregnant when I was there. They did a prayer circle in the courthouse around my stomach, you know, like it was a very loving, well, we both, like, I loved being there, and they, you know, just had a lot of love in their hearts, you know,
Mm.
so it was a collaboration, and that kind of, you know, that became sort of how Measures for Justice was born too. Like we're here by the grace of people that gave us a lot of love and attention, you know, when we didn't know what it was going to be.
Well, let me ask you about that, because that's a good transition, I think, to the next question I had in my mind, which was the, you know, the story. I speak the language of storytelling, so I talk about turning points a lot. And you know, and you were talking about earlier people who said this is impossible. I tried this myself when I was a bigwig in criminal justice system, and then you know, you find the right story, the right people, and you collaborate, and then lo and behold, this becomes real. But you know, that story of origin and that fundraising event I was talking about, that was, you know, more than 10 years ago, and I'm wondering, was there a particular turning point where, you know, you sort of saw, even for yourself, or maybe your team did, okay, this isn't just me now working on this and trying to get this going one grant at a time. I've got people around me now, and there are people who believe in this. Like, was there a turning point, or was it more sort of a gradual growth that happened? Because and we should probably say this, I mean, now Measures for Justice is a, you know, an organization with more than 60 employees, right? So and still growing. So, and you're in 20 states. You know, it didn't start out that way. So I'm just curious if you saw a moment of that curve, that growth curve going, you know, way up suddenly, or was it more of a gradual thing? And what happened? What was that? Was there that turning point or not?
Funny, I remember we had an enormous amount of opposition to us, and you know, it was really a network of judges who were very upset because they didn't think that we had the chops to create the measures. They wanted to create the measures, and we were like, "What if you create the measures? It'll never happen because they don't want to be measured." And so what we did was we went around and we showed them the data. And I remember this one time I was in this judge in Wisconsin's office, and I showed him some of the data, and you know, he was really excited by seeing it. And then he said, "But you can't compare one county to another." And I said, and I'd heard this so many times before. And he said, "It's like comparing an apple and an orange." And so I said, "Well, why can't you compare an apple and an orange? Like, you could say one's red and smooth, one's orange and bumpy. Like, why can't you compare those two things?" And he looked at me like irate, like it was like smoke. If we could have had smoke coming out of his ears. And he had his assistant by his side, and she was just glowering. And he said, "But I don't want a tomato in my fruit salad." And basically what he was saying was like, get out of my office. And I remember that. And I remember that after that meeting, like letters went around the county and even across the country about us, and saying that they didn't want the data to launch. And it was like the letters, they went to the Department of Justice, which is one of our funders. Like, it was really, and I remember I went back to my husband and I said, "Oh my God, like everybody hates what we're doing." And he said, "Amy, you're doing something important. They're doing, like, why are they all writing letters? Why are they? Like, what is it?" You know, and then I had that moment where I was like, "Oh, because," and you know, sometimes I miss that. Like, you know, sometimes, like, now everyone accepts, so you can measure justice, but back then you couldn't. And like, that's how I knew how relevant we were going to be, you know, was the pushback. And eventually, like, you know, it came out, they accepted it. But, you know, that kind of intensity, I think, was a moment where I realized, oh, we're really onto something.
And I imagine on the flip side of that, there were people who probably weren't judges, but who were saying, no, we actually do need this, and
Oh
we
my
need it
gosh.
now.
we had people pick it up and say like, oh, I'm going to change something because of this, or, you know, we had Florida created new legislation based on our measures to create all of our measures and put it all in one place. So we had huge victories and an enormous amount of momentum. But I think that the naysayers, the people who were so hostile about it, it was touching something on them where they just didn't, they wanted to be able to keep on doing the same old. The disruptiveness of it, I think, was realizing how disruptive it was, made me realize that we were really onto something.
Well, to use another C word, you struck a chord, and the story was starting to emerge in plain sight now, and their reactions were quite apparent from what you described. But I also admire when you're sharing is it's so easy to read articles about change management and big change, sweeping changes. A lot of your change management started with small conversations of connection. Like you talked about being in that town, how people came to know you as a person and connect with you and start to, you know, support you or at least acknowledge you while you're there in the work. And I'm sure you've been collecting conversations and listening. So was data and that, I think it's been it comes across to me that those were two powerful combinations that you combined together, conversations and just keep showing up too. That was the other part you did very
well.
well.
Oh God, that is such a huge lesson for this. It's like, you know, that's a funny story. In that state, Wisconsin, where we had so much trouble, years later, we went back there and we were trying to get something done. And the guy who's head of the court data said to me, "Good for you for staying in the saddle. I know what happened. Good for you for staying in the saddle." And I wanted to just, like, he knew, I mean, I don't even know really what was done to us. Like, I know that there were connections out there. Like, I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but I do believe that there can be like uncoordinated efforts that converge, and it was pretty bad. But he knew. So yeah, and the relationships didn't help that much in terms of like, we definitely sat with people and talked to them, but they really wanted to be in control of the narrative. You know, like
Of course.
the narrative is really powerful. And if you have data, it can be used to change the funding, to change the story. And they want to be able to tell a certain story, you know? And so that's why it's very disruptive and powerful to have someone come in and be like, okay, this is actually the story. And the story that you're saying, maybe it's true, but it could be, maybe we need to change it because another story.
Yeah. Here's the proof behind the story I have, right? That's the big, that's that powerful combination, right? Yeah. I wonder, Amy, for you as a leader, you know, because you've grown this organization over the last decade plus, and you know, I talked about the fact that now you've got 60 plus employees and still growing. What was that like for you? Like, were there I'm sure there were lessons learned, but moments for you as a leader where you felt, oh, this is no longer me and a couple of other people. It's, and also this whole idea of Measures for Justice is now, it's a real organization. It's got traction. There's, you know, we're in these states and I've got legislators calling me and prosecute, you know, all of the things that happened. I wonder for you as a leader, what was your what was your evolution as a leader? And did you have a particular turning point in your own experience of being a leader?
Such a good question. I mean, I think, one major turning point that I had, I still feel like in my head, like I'm in startup mode, that I can get in there and fix the things and, you know, but there have to be processes. And I'm not really, you know, I waited way too long to hire an HR person.
Yeah.
And I remember I interviewed like 13 people and was like, no, because HR people are like, you know, not like people who are people just love process. And I ended up having one candidate was I think she's okay. And basically I feel like in some ways she's one of the core people who has helped my organization mature. And I mean, thank God for people operations. That's and being ahead of the curve on things. We just bought a big package so that anybody could get a coach if they need it and having an issue. And scaling is really hard, and people bump into each other and ruffle each other. So now there's a hotline you can call a coach. I never would have thought of that. She's just making sure that your people are growing. You just cannot focus enough on that. That is, you could focus on, it sort of goes back and forth between focusing on growing your people and making sure that they're feeling challenged and they're getting what they want for their careers, and the outcome and the output for getting tools and services out there in the world. It's a constant, balance between the two, and knowing that HR is working on the making sure people are growing piece is really, really key. And I did not understand that for a long time and did not appreciate it. So all you HR people out there, I appreciate you.
That's such a good point, because you've hit on something where you're the founder, and in the beginning, you created it, you knew where all the pieces were, you knew all the players intimately in the work. And then as the business or the organization grows, there's that whole courageous act of knowing you have to let go of some aspects. And what you showed with the hiring of the HR person, the importance of diversity of thought, of having somebody else reflect back to what you were doing and what you had needed to sustain the staff you had found and the work they're doing. So I think that's so important. So I have a part B where you shared what you learned and what you were doing. But for people who are in leadership modes, is there anything you thought about that you wish you could go back and say 2020, this was something I wish I could have done a little differently at that point in time and didn't. And here's what I learned because I didn't do X, Y, and Z at that point.
Oh my gosh, there's so many things. I mean, we really started as a research organization and then became a tech organization, or a tech/product organization. But in the beginning, we just had to prove the methodology. And we had this great goal of doing 20 states. Now our work is more about, we have a product, it's called Commons. And the idea is to bring law enforcement to have this, very live, recent data with some of our measures, and then they can't get this tool, which is called Commons, unless they bring the community in to set mutual data-driven goals. And we're about to launch our second one at the end of this month. And we've seen how prosecutors will jump when they know that the community is watching them, and they'll get stuff done because they know that change is coming. This is the model I always wanted with, Quitman County. I wanted the people to be, they'll have the data and then go to the prosecutor and say, look, you represent us, we vote you, we pay for you, you're not representing a huge part of the population, we want to see your number change. And that never happened, but now we're finally getting to it. And I wish that it hadn't been such a struggle in the beginning to convince people that you could measure justice, and we could have done this earlier, or we could have pivoted earlier to do this, because I feel like now finally doing, this is the hill that has to be climbed for this country, because what you're seeing is a redistribution of power, right? You're seeing how people in the communities, the ACLU is at the table, so is the NAACP, so is a person from the white suburb, so is, they're all there saying, this is what we care about, why aren't you doing this? Do this with us, we'll help you. Those hard conversations is really the whole point. So I feel like 10 years in, I'm finally getting there, but I wish it could have come sooner, and I want it to go faster, more better.
But figuring out what battles you could fight and win in small battles in this, at the start of it, I think was what your takeaway was. What do you need to
We would
choose
never
for us?
be able to be here if we hadn't gone through that.
Mhm.
You know, I learned so much about working with states and counties and so much about the country and the way that there are systems behind systems behind systems. It's like you think there's a system, but then there's a system behind the system behind the system. Like there's a whole, like we think you know this country or this system, but you don't. So there's webs and relationships
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I think that's really, we've kind of coming full circle here because, in my mind anyway, because behind this data are people, and behind this organization, Measures for Justice, that's seen this growth are people as well, and it's all these different people and relationships that really move something forward. Go from an idea to something that's real to then something that grows. I think this is just really great to get these insights, great lessons here. And I want to ask you a question that we ask all of our guests, which is around an experience. Could you tell us about an experience that's shaped who you are today, that you still sort of think about perhaps regularly, or something that is kind of, you don't have to scratch far down the surface to find it, something that you still carry forward with you?
Well, since last night, Measures for Justice was, I was by the side of the pool watching my son swim last night. I drove him a half hour so he could swim 2 hours with a swim team. I think about him swimming a lot, and the whole organization was born by the side of a pool. We originally started swimming. He's now 15. He originally started swimming because he couldn't do, when he was in pre-K, crisscross applesauce. He had trouble sitting in the circle, and he needed his core. Everyone talks about core in this country. Like, how's your core? We never talked about core years ago, but like, core.
You're kidding me.
Your core needs work. And basically, he was considered, he wasn't strong enough, and he needed, by comparison to his peers. And so I had him swim at the Y, and he'd swim on little teams. And I mean, I remember in the beginning, I wanted to jump in the pool because I thought like he wouldn't make it. Like he remember he barely could keep his head up because he wasn't strong enough. And gradually he made it onto a team. And today he's in 9th grade and he's on the varsity swim team. And he was, I think, 14th in Western New York for all 4 strokes for, the IM. And I think about this, and it's because what he did was he just kept on running his hand through the water 4 to 5 times a week, just kept on pushing down. And I think about that a lot. And now he's like incredibly strong, obviously, like he's got a real swimmer's physique and the whole thing. But if you just keep on working at it, you get strong. So just keep on working at it every day, and you can become really successful. But you just got to do the work and make it regular. And eventually, even when you get good at it, you start to love it. And that's what happened with him. He got good at it, saw some success, and then he really dove in. So even if it is hard at first and you feel like you're drowning, just keep on going.
It's a great story to back up resilience and endurance.
Yeah, there's so much in there. We could unpack that story for hours. But it's really beautiful, and yeah, what a great lesson. And even once again, I don't want to get too meta because we are a storytelling organization, but it is amazing to me, the power of story, because even I've heard a couple of versions of that story, obviously, from a little while ago. And so, and you brought it right up to the moment. And to know that he's still swimming, he's still doing it, and he's like 14th, and wow, it actually moves me. I care about your.
I'm so moved by him. I gotta tell you, and the amount that he loves it. And I said to him, the other thing is that like a lot of the parents all along the way sort of were like, they were really into the kid being a swim kid. I didn't care at all. Like, I still don't care. Like, if you told me I said, if we said to you couldn't swim anymore, how would you feel? And he said, he goes, I'm so much better when I do it. It's now something that he does himself. It's just, I feel like, and as a parent, it's like such a gift for him that it's like his thing now, it's
Wow.
his thing that makes him feel centered. So it's like, I didn't understand that about parenthood, like that there are these things, there are these moments where you've got to get in there and go deep. And that's the same thing in the organization. There are these crucial moments where you're like, okay, problem, it came across my radar. I've got to get in there and focus and get through it. And then it ends up like being this thing that grows into something they take it on themselves. It's very similar. The parenthood organization thing is very similar.
Interesting. Yeah. Really fascinating. I don't know, Jules, if you have any other comments or reflections.
No, I've asked so much. Of course, I could sit here forever and ask you questions, but thank you so much for the gift. It's so informative.
Thank you guys.
It's such a template for other organizations and running change about what to keep in mind. So let's make this the beginning of a conversation and discuss some more as we go forward in another time.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Amy, for giving us so many insights and lessons that people can take away from, whether, no matter what organization they're working for or whether they have their own organization. I think these lessons are really lessons in leadership and life, really, that are super helpful. I wonder if there's anything that you want to let us know or let our listeners know about Measures for Justice. We have your website, obviously, where people can go and find out more about your organization and the portal and the product you mentioned, Commons. But is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with in this moment, other than the website link, which is measuresforjustice.org, I should say?
Yeah, tune in at the end of the month, because at the end of, or if you're listening to this after it launches at the end of March, beginning of April, we should be launching the second Commons with them. And I don't know what the public goal is going to be yet. They're around today. They're working on it. So go look and see and check it out and think about whether you want to bring data to your community to create change.
Great. Wonderful. We'll make sure to put that in our episode notes when this comes out, so people can know where to find it. Well, thanks so much once again, Amy. Really was great to have you. And I just want to remind our listeners that aside from checking out Measures for Justice at measuresforjustice.org, you can also go to Narrative's website at narrative.com, NARATIV.com, where you'll find all our old episodes before this one, as well as our blog posts, which come out pretty regularly, and you've got a bunch of free resources there. And if you or your organization are interested in finding out how you can find, craft, and tell really powerful stories like the ones we heard today, please don't hesitate. We're always listening, and you can go to narrative.com to find out more. Thanks so much. Thanks, Jules, for being my wonderful co-host. Absolutely. As always.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Till
and
the next
thanks
time.
Again. Thanks again, Amy, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Here's a special announcement for you, podcast listeners. If you want to learn how to tell your own leadership story exactly the way that Amy Bach told her story in this episode, now is your chance. We're launching a 3-part online series called Leading with Story, starting on April 27, 2023. And you can now register online by either going to narrative.com, NARATIV.com, or clicking on the link in this show's episodes. We look forward to seeing you there. Thanks.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.